Hello, everybody. In the last episode, I briefly touched on the idea of story touchstones, but I didn't go into detail, and I got a fair number of questions about them, so I figured I'd make them into their own episode. They deserve it. This is a really powerful technique that you can learn in, 10 minutes, so let's go over it. A story touchstone is a way to invite people into your universe. It's a way to give them something concrete to help them tell their stories. And it happens in every universe, whether on purpose or on accident. So I brought up the idea of Star Wars, and Star Wars has a huge number of story touchstones that are so iconic that it's hard to believe they weren't on purpose. I think that they probably were. So the idea of a lightsaber, the lightsaber which represents the soul of a Jedi, this was imported from Japanese cinema, but it remains a very, very omnipresent part of Star Wars fiction, of the universe of Star Wars, and people immediately know how they should feel and what sort of stories are going to be told when someone pulls out a lightsaber. Similarly, Force powers like Force lightning. Now, the light Jedi powers that were introduced later, like kinetic pushes and stuff, those have a more complicated nature, and they probably aren't as much of a touchstone as they might be, but the Force lightning, right from the very start, this was an excellent touchstone. It showed that someone was not a true noble warrior. It showed that they were a devious magician rather than, an upright noble warrior. And it was a very powerful way to show that Darth Vader and the Emperor were two completely different categories of enemy. But Star Wars has hundreds of touchstones. The Doomsday swamps, the dark side swamps, these are touchstones. They allow someone to tell a story about doubt or darkness in someone's heart without needing to set up complicated situations where, they have to go to a city and kill someone or find a crime to hesitantly block or whatever. Instead, you send them into the swamp and they hallucinate. Job done. You're ready to go. The idea of a ship, small ships with hyperspace drives, that was also a very good touchstone. The idea that you could go anywhere in the universe with a crew of two is radically different than, say, Star Trek, which has ships that are huge, and you need like 400 people to cross the universe. So each of these things are touchstones. Even something as odd-sounding as floating cities, this is a touchstone in the Star Wars universe. The idea is you can say, oh, it's a floating city, and people will immediately get a feel for what sort of stories are going to happen there. They're going to feel Bespin-y. So these touchstones will allow anyone who holds onto them to immediately create stories which are similar to the ones that were told in canon, but are able to be told by another person with their own slant and their own interests. And you obviously know that Star Wars has a tremendous following, and almost all of the stories in the Star Wars universe use these touchstones. Not all of them, but some subset of them, the subset that helps tell the stories they want to tell. And that is why Star Wars is so powerful. But Star Wars is far from the only show that has touchstones. Let's approach touchstones from the other direction. Star Trek also has touchstones, but they are kind of accidental. So the only Star Trek touchstone that was on purpose was the Enterprise. The Enterprise obviously is iconic right from the start, but even though the Enterprise is iconic, it's far from unique. Every ship in the Star Wars universe has the same idea behind it. It's a huge ship with a huge crew. You need hundreds of people to cross space. This is a universe where you cannot just hop in with Chewbacca and drive to the other side of the galaxy. In order to go anywhere in Trek, you need to have a crew of hundreds. You need to work together to move through space. And that's core to the concept of Star Trek, which is that you have to work together. Star Trek has a large number of other touchstones. For example, the scanners or long-range communicators, and the teleporter pads. These things were introduced right from the start as fun little technological conveniences. They weren't touchstones initially, but they became touchstones as the effect that they should have on the world became obvious to the people who were writing these Trek episodes. You've got a teleporter, and that means that you can do these things with the teleporter, and that becomes part of the Trek universe. It becomes part of so many stories. Obviously, many of those stories are things like, oh, people beam in and fight you. But some of those stories are more complex, like, oh, Riker got split into two, and now he's living in two places. Or Commander Kirk, or Captain Kirk gets split into light side and dark side Kirk. There's lots of stories you can tell with the teleporters, and so they became iconic even though they didn't start that way. They became story touchstones even though they didn't start that way. Another story touchstone is, of course, the ever-popular room, the holodeck, which doesn't make much sense, but it is a touchstone. It allows you to tell a lot of stories, because inside the holodeck, you can allow your characters to create any universe they want, briefly. This is a fantastic way to allow your characters to explore the universe inside as well as outside, to explore other pieces that they wouldn't really be able to do by using a ship. And since Star Trek is kind of a cerebral show, at least it used to be, the idea is that you can show variants or unusual places without having to break your world to do it. So it was really a very good idea, and it's a story touchstone in its own way. Now, all of these story touchstones are not stories. You don't pick up a teleporter and say, I have a story to tell now. But when you have a story to tell, you might be inspired by the teleporter, or you might say this story can use the teleporter and that'll make the story punchier. When you have something as powerful as a holograph or a holodeck, you can go into the holodeck and do parts of your story if they require that kind of convenience. Similarly, stories can come out of the holodeck if they require that kind of convenience. Great example of that, the always popular episode where I think it was Captain Picard, oh, maybe it was Riker, either one, they tried to have the holodeck create an enemy that could defeat Data, rather than Data's character, and therefore Moriarty came to life and tried to escape the holodeck, and it was a really cool episode for like a 12-year-old. And I think it still probably holds up okay today. Lack of safeguards aside. Everything has story touchstones. Harry Potter has lots of story touchstones. Harry Potter inherited one that was kind of an unusual one that I didn't expect. Harry Potter and the idea of wands has become, inextricably linked. Now, wands have been around forever, but they have become part of Harry Potter's touchstones because there weren't wands for a long time, and then Harry Potter came along and made them a centerpiece. So even though wands have been around forever, Harry Potter jumped in and used them at a time when there weren't very many people talking about them. So Harry Potter has all of the wands now. If you see a wand, you're going to think Harry Potter. But Harry Potter also has the idea of potion class, and Harry Potter has the idea of paintings that are animate and will walk around and can't be bothered to actually stand around in the painting all day. Harry Potter has the idea of staircases that continually reshape themselves and go new places. Harry Potter has the idea of tests where you are told to test out your spells by doing something specific and trying to, find a specific object. There are a lot of these touchstones. Not all of them are things. Some of them are events or processes. But these are not simply iconic. They are patterns which you can use in your own stories. And to say that you can use them is an understatement, because you're going to use them. Nobody tells a Harry Potter story without including wands and classes and tests and paintings that move and house elves and people who can't be named because it summons them. All of these things are a core part of the Harry Potter universe. And even though none of them is unique, none of them, was invented specifically for Harry Potter, they combine in a way which makes the Harry Potter universe super powerful. And you can tell so many stories so easily because they have all of these touchstones. And you're not going to use all of them all the time, but you're going to use a lot of them. And you're going to be like, okay, I want to go tell a story in the Harry Potter universe because I want to have an owl. Yeah, I want to have an owl to deliver stuff for me. I want to go to the Harry Potter universe because I also want to learn how to pull streetlights off of the street lamps. I want to go to the Harry Potter universe and raise a dragon. There are so many concrete things that happen in those books that became touchstones because they were part of a replicable universe. They were like, you're going to school and you're taking this class. Yes, it's only mentioned once in the book that you are going to raise a dragon or whatever, but that's something that's part of the school. And hey, I can put that in my story too. I can imagine myself doing that thing. And it's not like, Luke going down the trench run, which is iconic, but it's not a touchstone because no one else can really use it. It's much more general because everyone can use it. Everyone can take these tests because they happen every year. Everyone can talk to these paintings because they're everywhere. It's really a great, great universe for touchstones. And I think that some of these touchstones were on purpose, and some of them were on accident, and some of them were inherited, and some of them weren't. It's a messy situation, but this is the sort of thing you can do on purpose. And you should do it on purpose. When you invent these touchstones, you're going to quickly realize that they are the things people are going to remember about your universe. Not all the things. There are iconic things that aren't touchstones, but you're going to have a lot of these. And let's go back to our story about a universe where you can Pokemon-style absorb monsters and take them into your heart or your soul or whatever. And we talked a lot about the themes that might allow us to explore, like having multiple people you want to beat a day, or being overwhelmed by your bestial side, or any of those sorts of stories. There's a lot of cool ideas that could be told. But what we didn't talk about is the kinds of story touchstones that we might use to actually build this universe. And normally speaking, I just kind of riff along when I'm doing these. I'm like, blah, 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 because most of it's pretty obvious. But when it comes to creating, it takes a lot of effort, and you've got to sit down and you've got to consider a lot of things. Like, for example, do we want a touchstone which represents a monster that has been absorbed? So, for example, do you get like a tattoo representing the monster you've absorbed? Or maybe you get a piece of jewelry or a gem that you want to mount on a piece of jewelry. Or maybe it's in your eyes. And inside of your eyes, you can see the monsters instead of the reflection of what should be reflected there. There are a lot of possibilities. Maybe it's in your shadow, and as your shadow gets light cast on it, you can see the monsters that you've eaten coming out of your shadow. And this is already got some cool ideas. Can you imagine a world like that? A world where the shadows betrayed the monsters that you had eaten? A world where your eyes weren't reflecting whatever was in front of you, but instead whatever you had inside of you. These are pretty good ideas. And it's worth thinking about them and trying to figure out what sort of things can be made really, really powerful and really, really obvious. The shadow one, which I didn't think of until I said it, this is a really good one because the story touchstone needs to reflect both the concepts of the world and the story tone that you're trying to tell, the theme of the story. So in this case, you can think of story touchstones sort of like as packaged themes. And in this case, the shadow is a good way to thematically connect the monster to the person. The monster inside of you can be displayed as a shadow because it is literally your shadow in some way. You're trying to fight the things which are inside of you, and you can't get rid of them, and you can't see them real, like they're not popping out of your body, but they're part of you. They're like your shadow. And it also draws from the cinematic convention of having distorted monstrous shadows. So it's a pretty good idea. There are a lot of other possibilities. In fact, there are an infinite number of possibilities. But we have a lot of other touchstones that we might want to talk about. If we wanted to talk about the concept of having to choose who you're going to be, then we might have to talk about the idea of an in-world touchstone which allows a character to choose between monsters. So rather than just, saying, I've got these 3 monsters inside of me, and for now I'm going to switch between A, B, and C. I'm just going to go ahead and bloop, switch. We want to go with a mechanism for that, something which has to be done in order to do that. And it might be anything, like it might be a specific kind of, changing your clothes, or some kind of ritual involving some specific thing, like an incense candle that you have to burn. Something which involves a particular action in the world which could be prevented or screwed up. It might be as easy as like a tea ceremony, which you could do on your own, or there's a lot of options, but this is the sort of thing where you brainstorm it and you're like, what sort of touchstones do we want? If we want to tell stories about people who have to choose who they're going to be today, then we need to make that choosing a touchstone. We need to make that massive aspect of our story into a massive aspect of our world, so that anyone who visits our world can use it as well. Anyway, I hope that you have understood my concept of story touchstones. Go ahead and tell me if you recognize any story touchstones or what sort of story touchstones you might be inventing. Whew. And that's it. I better stop before the cars start honking.